Hello there. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name's Chris from HOFA. We're streaming another time. We're streaming live from HOFA Studios, which is in Karlsdorf, Germany. And I have a special guest today, again, for a HOFA studio talk. My guest today is called Marc Urselli. Say hello, Marc.
Hello, everyone. How are you?
Nice to have you here. Well, let's maybe
Thank you for
start with...
having me.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. Thanks for taking the time. Let's start with a little bit of name dropping here because you can't really avoid that bit. Sorry for that. Marc is a producer, record engineer, recording engineer, mixing engineer, and also front of house engineer. He also does master some of his own stuff as far as I know. We'll talk about that later. He has worked with aspiring artists like U2, Foo Fighters, Lou Reed, Nick Cave, Elton John, etc., etc. Mike Patton, John Zorn, which I really like those records. Well, welcome, Marc. It's a great pleasure to have you here in our live stream.
Nice to be here.
You also, if I'm rightly informed, you are also chief house engineer at Eastside Sound. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Eastside Sound is one of the two longest running studios in New York City, together with Electric Lady, which was Jimi Hendrix's studio. Electric Lady opened in 71, I think. We opened in 72. So it's going to be 50 years next year.
Wow. That's a great history in that building, isn't it?
Indeed. Lots of records have been made there, primarily jazz, but also other rock records.
Wow. So how did you come there? As far as I know, you weren't born in USA. I think you originated from Switzerland first. How did you get over there, and how did your career start?
Well, I got over there by plane, and that was in 1999. I went there for an internship. I was born in Switzerland, grew up in Italy. I have a Swiss mother and an Italian father. In Italy, I had a recording studio in my parents' basement where I opened around 96 or 97. So I was already recording bands and having clients, but I felt like I needed to further my career and look beyond my horizons. So I decided to take a plane to New York and do an internship in an established recording studio like Eastside Sound. And then, of course, New York blew my mind, as it does. And so I decided to find a way to stay. And that took me a while, of course, because of visas and all of that. But I've now been living in the US for 20 years, basically, or more, making tons of records at Eastside Sound and also flying around the world and working as a freelancer in other studios.
Okay, I see. So you changed the studio side based on the project, or where your client prefers to work, or how really does that come? I mean, you could, as a chief house engineer at Eastside, I imagine you have your home base, you know every single cable in that house probably after a couple of years. So I imagine you would rather take the artist or whomever you work with into Eastside, or how does that work?
Yeah, you're correct. I'm very comfortable at Eastside. It's very easy and fast for me to get a great drum sound, for example. So I do like to work at Eastside, and I prefer working there. But sometimes the client wants to go somewhere else. Sometimes the client is somewhere else, as in another city, in another country. And sometimes I need more space. Eastside is great. It has 6 ISO booths around the live room, so I can do 7 musicians completely isolated. I can do up to 15 musicians. I have done up to 15 or 18 musicians. But if I'm doing something even bigger, I need a bigger space. For example, a couple years ago, I recorded a 40-piece choir, and that was a little too tight at Eastside. So I went to Sears Sound in New York, which is a beautiful studio, also one of the long-running establishments of New York City. They have a large live room, and that's where I usually go if I need more space in New York.
I see. So it's not that big of a room, but it's many of them, right? So I mean, 7 live rooms with side contact and everything. That's
yeah.
quite a big facility.
There's a large live room that has a piano in it, in which I've done like chamber orchestras of like 10 people. So that's about the size of the room. And then there's 6 smaller ISO booths. The largest one can fit a piano or a drum set. And the smallest one is just for one person singing, and everything in between. So 7 rooms of different sizes and different shapes. For those interested, you can check out eastsidesound.nyc, and you can see pictures of all the ISO booths and of the live room and of even the line of sight. You can see on the website how it looks from one ISO booth into the live room and into the other ISO booths. There's perfect line of sight out of 4 out of those 6 ISO booths, and partial line of sight out of the other 2. So it's a great studio to do live recordings in with isolation. And in fact, it's been a great asset during COVID because people wanted to be isolated. So the isolation actually became sort of a health and safety requirement during COVID, which really helped us continue working.
Wow, that's some extra point here, yeah. Well, you certainly didn't think about that when building that. But
no, we didn't think about COVID, but we did think when we built this. Oh, sorry, I'm getting phone calls. When we built this studio, we did think about the fact that people are recording everything more and more in an isolated way, and more they are looking for clean tracks so that they can later edit the tracks together. So in that sense, yes, we thought about that. We kind of saw that change coming. And the studio in its current incarnation was built around 2001. The studios existed since 1972, but in 2001 we moved to a new building, and that's when we did this multi ISO booth design.
Yeah. And as a musician, you really need the line of sight. I can tell you, guys. I mean, there are many recording studios out there which are just basically built into some sort of building that was already there. And if you don't have the possibility to move the walls or whatever and really get that line of sight, you have to somehow work with cameras or something. But that latency, that possibility to not the loss of possibility to look each other in the eye and so on, it's so hard for musicians, especially in the rhythm basics.
No,
so you really need that.
I'm a big believer in recording people together, playing together. I like music where there's this organic feeling coming from people interacting with each other. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I like working at East Side Sound when I'm in New York. I don't like making things one piece at a time. I don't like doing the drums first and then the bass. I like people playing together because I think you get better records.
Yeah, you can definitely hear that in the records you made. I mean,
thank you. That's a great compliment. I appreciate that.
And I appreciate listening to it because I think you're very, very right. Of course, in the end, it's about what kind of music you're making and so on. But you went through loads and loads of genres, of course, over your time. Actually, that's quite astonishing because you're doing jazz records, you're doing rock records, pop records, classical records, everything, and even those things by John Zorn, for example, we just dropped that name earlier, or Mike Patton or things like that. Those guys are very, very influential and very experimental as well. So it's not just... I imagine it's not just very interesting to work with those experimental artists, but also to capture that live performance of, which is totally live, I guess. I mean, you can't really fix it, and no performance is like the other, right?
Exactly. Everything I do with John Zorn is live, basically. We never. I mean, there might be an overdub of a solo, but the basic structure of the piece is played live together in the same studio. And that's how I like to do most of my records whenever I have a chance. If I'm producing, I definitely push for that.
Wow, that's cool. So that's more of old school, right? I mean, especially in the pop world. You can call it
old school if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can call it old school if you want. I mean, I think it's the right school rather than the old school.
It's the
I mean,
soul school.
all the records. I mean, think about it. All the records that inspire us today, even the people that make records piecemealing things one piece at a time, if you ask them what records inspire them, they often will mention records by the Beatles or whatever, the Beach Boys, the Stones, and all of those records were done playing together. So
Very true.
I'm not sure why we're trying to reinvent that wheel if it's tried and true. Obviously, there's 50 plus years of music recordings, 100 years of music recordings that attest to the fact that when people play together, magic happens. We're trying to recreate that magic, piecemealing things to cut corners and save money, but I don't think that's the right way to do it for a certain type of record. There's of course always exceptions. There's different genres and different kind of records, different kind of needs that you might have in a record. So I'm not, I'm not a purist in that sense. I'm not a stickler. I'm not saying everything has to be done that way. That's just my preference for a rock or a jazz record where the organic interplay is important.
Yeah, you said a couple of very, very true things here, because the artists playing together with their band and playing live, that's really where the magic happens. And I saw actually, and I heard before, you are also front of house engineer, which actually is that because you like the way a live band sounds, or how come? I mean, most engineers are either in the studio or either on the live side of things. How come you do both?
It just kind of happened in the sense that I always pursued both career paths, even from like very, very young. When I was 17 and I started my adventures in audio, shall we call them, I started mixing live shows. I started working with the local PA rental and hire companies. And that's where I cut my teeth in terms of live. And then I continued doing so when I moved to New York. And I am now at a point where I'm super comfortable in both environments. I don't feel out of place in one or the other. And because of that, certain other things have happened. For example, I'm able to use techniques that I've learned in the studio in a live setting and vice versa. And the other great thing that happens is sometimes, like with Zorn or with Lou Reed, I get to work with the same artist live that I work with in the studio. And so there's an extra special type of connection between the front of house engineer and the artist, because I know the body language. For example, with Zorn, I know all his body movements, what he's expecting from the musicians, and that helps you mix a show, because when you know how Zorn moves and how Zorn interacts with his musicians, you can anticipate a guitar solo or a keyboard solo or whatnot, even if you don't know the music because it's not written or because you're not part of the band.
Yeah. Reading the body language of musicians is very, very helpful, and it's not always easy, but after having worked with an artist or artist and engineer duo like you have with Zorn for years now, you probably know each of his movements very well by now. Yeah, cool. So that's really interesting. You said there were some techniques from the studio you would use live and some the other way around. Can you give us an example maybe of one or two techniques you would take from the one world to the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm not thinking of a specific technique. I was just thinking that I experiment and try things live that I've tried in the studio. For example, I was doing a version of virtual soundcheck before virtual soundchecks existed, live, I mean, because I thought to myself, what if I record the vocal mic of an artist so that I can then listen to that over the PA. So I would record it the night before and listen to it the next day at soundcheck before the band would come in. to make sure that the vocal of the singer really is EQ'd perfectly, and I can EQ out the bleed of the drums and things like that in the vocal mic. These are things I was doing without the use of virtual soundcheck, which is basically what virtual soundcheck allows you to do now. But the idea came from me having a recording engineer background. Another example is multiband compression. It's something that I like doing on my mixes in the studio. And then at some point, I started experimenting with it live and applying multiband compression live. Now it's, of course, a thing that everyone does, but not necessarily 15 years ago or so. So things like that, I just borrow from the studio and try it live and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes sense as working with musicians. I mean, musicians always, 99% of them come from the studio to the stage and from the stage back to the studio. That's basically their life. So why shouldn't the engineer's life be the same?
That's a very good way to put it. I like that.
Cool. Right before our call here, our live stream, we said off camera, you told me you produced and mixed an album with John Zorn in 5 hours. Is that really true? Is that even possible?
I didn't produce it. I recorded and mixed it in 5 hours.
I'm sorry.
Zorn produced all his own records. Yes, it's possible because of the type of record we made. We made an improvised jazz record with Dan Weiss on drums, Trevor Dunn on bass, and Miles Okazaki on guitar. Zorn played saxophone on a couple of the tunes. Because it's improvised and therefore you don't need to rehearse. You just need to play off of each other. Again, comes back to how important it is to play off of each other. That kind of record can be done in that amount of time because I have my assistant set up for me ahead of time, meaning setting up all the mics, the amps, the drums, etc. So I can walk in with the musicians and they can play. And then while they're playing and doing their performances, I'm already working on a preliminary mix so that when they come back in and listen, my mix is already sounding pretty good. And then I can do whatever final touch-ups. So an hour of music for a CD basically in this case, took 5 hours to record and mix.
Wow, impressive. So that's a pure analog mix, or do you do that all in Pro Tools? Or
I like hybrid mixes, meaning I do record to Pro Tools, and I do mix in Pro Tools. I do my automation in Pro Tools, but I like analog summing and going through an analog console. So that's my favorite way of working. That doesn't mean I can do the whole mix in the box if need to, and I do that for many artists who cannot afford to work in the studio. I'm very comfortable both ways, analog or digital or hybrid, but hybrid is my favorite way of working.
Yeah, best of both worlds, as they say. Yeah.
Exactly.
It really makes sense, especially I myself love putting it in the front end and at the very back of the process you have, and it sounds like you do it similarly, like doing all the very heavy processing and stuff. You do that in Pro Tools because you can recall it and so on, and you can do many revisions, and after that you simply sum it over your console.
Yeah, and the front end is always analog in the sense that I keep my signal path super short. I don't even go through the console when I'm recording. I go microphone to preamp to Pro Tools. And that's because I believe the shortest signal path will yield the best results.
Wow, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So you use the preamps in the console and you just pull out right after it, like the direct out?
Yeah, if I'm using the preamps of the console, then I take the output of the preamp and go directly into Pro Tools. Or if I'm using an outboard preamp, with the patch bay, I patch the microphone into the preamp and the output of the preamp directly into the input of Pro Tools.
Wow, no EQ, no compression whatsoever.
Correct. No EQ, no compression. I pretty much never record with EQ or compression very rarely some compression, and the only EQ I would do is a high pass filter. But again, I prefer doing those things after. I prefer recording everything in full range so that I have my options open when it comes to mix time.
Yeah, I mean, why not? Usually a digital low cut doesn't sound that bad.
Yeah, I mean, look, Al Schmidt, one of the greatest engineers of our time, has taught us, and I've lived by that if something doesn't sound right, and in the recording, you move the mic until it does sound right. So don't try to EQ it. Don't try to coax it up with EQ when you can just move the mic and get the right sound. Get it right in, and then you'll have a much easier time mixing it later.
A very good tip. And it will not just be easier and cheaper to mix because you don't need that much studio hours. It will also simply get better results.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just more real in the end.
Absolutely.
You already mentioned that you send in your assistants into the recording space before you come, and you give them like setup, I suppose, like where to put what mic and so on, to which preamp to use, and that's basically your chain, right? So that leads me to my next question: How much importance do you put on the preparation of a project, and when does that start?
Preparation is super important. I'm a big advocate for preparedness in general. I've learned through years of working with producer Hal Wilner, for example, how important it is to prepare and to over-prepare. In the case of somebody like Hal was famous for saying there would be 2 guitar players, but then 4 guitar players would show up. So if I was working with somebody like Hal, I would basically always account for more channels and more headphones and more of everything than what Hal told me would be there. But yeah, I always work with an assistant, either my own assistant if it's at Eastside Sound, or if I'm working in a different studio, I just talk to whoever is the assistant engineer at the different studio, and I look at the mic list that they have available and the preamp list, and I make a list of which mics and which preamps I want to use on what instruments. And if there's multiple ISO booths, I tell them in what booths to put which instruments. And I just send the list via email to the assistant. And at Eastside, I have people that work for me and just go in 2 or 3 hours before and get that all ready, so that when I arrive, all I have to do is move the mic in the place I want it to be, and turn up the gain on the preamp.
Cool. Yeah, that definitely makes it faster. Yeah, totally makes sense. And how much pre-planning talk is there done together with the artist or the producer beforehand? So, I mean, I know that as for a guitar player, for example, his guitar and his amp is part of his sound. So the same is true even for vocalists or something who don't have an instrument or something. It's their microphone. So for many musicians and artists, their mic is part of their sound. Do you plan that before? Do you talk to the artist beforehand to make sure you have that mic going, or how do you approach that?
It depends on who's coming in and what we're doing. If it's a famous singer, for example, I will ask them if they have a favorite mic they want to use or not. And if it's not, but oftentimes most artists trust the engineers and know that we know what's best, and we know how to capture sounds. So if there's that kind of trust established, as there is, for example, with John Zorn, there's not really a question. I mean, I know what John Zorn's favorite mic is on his saxophone, and so I just put that out for him. There's not even a need to talk about that. But of course, I've done over 100 records with Zorn. If it's somebody new that I've not worked with before, then I ask them if they have a mic preference or what they're bringing. As you said, if it's a guitar player, I ask them if they want to use my amp or if they want to bring their amp. If it's a drummer, I ask them if they want to use one of our drum sets. We have 3 drum sets at Eastside Sound. jazz or rock, different sizes, or if they want to bring their drums. Those kind of conversations are all being fielded before, but usually it's something that can be addressed in a couple of emails.
Sure. You just have to ask the right questions if they don't do it on their own.
Yeah. And, I mean, it's easy to ask the right questions when you've been doing this for 20 years. You know what questions to ask.
Sure. You know what's going to go wrong if you don't ask.
Exactly.
You already said working at East Side Sound, you'll have your own assistant who know the space and so on. And when working at another studio, some kind of different studio, you would always work with the house engineer staff, which is there, which totally makes sense for me because they know the floors and the cables and so on in their location, and they also know the acoustic environments usually quite well. But can you always rely on that? I mean, I personally went to a couple of studios, not to mention any names, but where I had the problem that the space was totally fine, the equipment was totally fine, but the staff wasn't. So is there any tip for some freelancer how to approach those things?
Luckily I haven't had that happen to me. I'm sure it can happen. I think it comes down to talking to people. If you have a talk before on the phone with people, with the staff, I think you can get a sense of what's going on with the staff, of whether they're going to be helpful or not. And if they're not helpful, you can ask for a different assistant, So, I mean, everyone works and needs to be respected. But if somebody is not willing to put in the work, then I'd rather work with somebody else. Honestly, I haven't had that happen to me, that what you mentioned. All the studios I've been to, like Sear Sound, the Village Recorders in LA, I have always had a great rapport with the assistant engineers, to the point where we kind of became friendly and we keep in touch. And now the next time I go to Sear Sound, I know who to email, and I know who I'm going to be working with, and it's never been an issue. In the bigger studios, people are usually professionals and they know how to handle people that come from the outside world. So there hasn't really been that issue. I think what you're describing hopefully only happens in smaller studios where they haven't acquired yet a taste for collaboration, and they haven't understood that the best things come out of working together.
Very true. Yeah, I mean, luckily there's enough engineers out there and enough assistants and so on. So usually studios have the opportunity to choose their staff, and usually they get lots of training before they get into direct contact with the client. So you're very right. It usually just appears in the mid-range or in the lower range of the studios, which can't afford having enough stuff or to teach them. Cool. So you already mentioned that you have a really, really short front end chain, which is basically just mic and the acoustic space, where to put it, and the preamp, and directly to Pro Tools. So that leads me to the questions. I mean, we all know how important mics are, but how important is the mic pre-choice for your personal, for the capture of sound and for your ears?
Well, it's very important, and people often forget the importance of the preamp. I hear I get all these questions from artists asking me, hey, what mic should I buy for my vocal or for my guitar or for this or that? And I always say, yeah, I can give you a mic, but what are you putting the mic in? Because the mic is only going to sound as good as the preamp you plug it in. So if you buy a $5,000 mic and then you put it into a $100, the preamp of your $100 sound card interface, audio interface, you can't expect the same result that you're going to have if you plug in that same mic in a studio through an Eve preamp. So that's a question. That's a part of my answer very often. So yeah, for me, the preamp is very important. I own almost 100 microphones. And I own tons of preamps. I have 32 Neve preamps. I have some preamps that people know less, like a Japanese brand called Simpro Seed that I really like, Harrison preamps, API Focusrite. The choices, Ampex 351s, the choices are broad at each side. And I always think about the pairing of three things: the mic with the preamp with the instrument. The three things are closely interconnected and go together. So if I'm recording, for example, a saxophone, I will choose a ribbon microphone. And if I choose a ribbon microphone, I have to use a microphone preamp that has a lot of clean gain, because some other preamps like don't have enough gain for ribbons. And so those are things to keep in mind. The other things to keep in mind is whether you're looking for a really transparent sound, in which case I can use, for example, the Simpro Seed I mentioned before, or whether I'm going for a more colored sound, in which case I can use a preamp that has some grit in it, like an old Altec. We have a lot of Altecs at Eastside Sound. So that kind of, it's important to know what you're going to record and whether you're going for full transparency or character.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, I'm totally with you on that point, because I think most beginners in that sense, they really forget the importance, or they don't hear it yet, the importance of the right mic pre, because, and I mean, it's not that much of a miracle, because there's loads of gain happening usually in the mic pre. I mean, that's going from thousands of volts up to a volt or something, so that's a lot of energy put in there. And yeah, I mean, that must do some sound, and it really doesn't. And there's no such thing as the ultimate preamp in my ears. I mean, I'm a real lover of the 1073, as most of us are probably, but it's not always the right mic pre, right? You need some transparency sometimes.
Yeah, and you're right about saying that less experienced musicians don't always hear it, but also it's not only a matter of their hearing, it's a matter of their experience, because we as engineers have access to multiple mics and multiple preamps, and we can learn those differences. But a guitar player that records himself at home or herself at home doesn't really have that kind of broad spectrum of mic availability and preamp availability to even create that kind of experience. And so I don't blame them for not knowing. The other thing that's important is how things are perceived. You know, when you see pictures of musicians, you see all these pictures of the Beatles, for example, and you see all these microphones, and then you see that, that Jeff Emmerich, the engineer, has used a Coles on the drums at some point. And so now everyone is buying the Coles. And then you see some pictures with the Reslos on the vocal. And so everyone is buying the Reslos. But there's no pictures of the preamp. And so people forget about the preamps. They forget about the importance of the preamps. But if you look closely for the Beatles fanatics, there's, for example, pictures of Altex 436Cs that were used in the studio. And if you have one of those beautiful books that came out a few years ago about the Beatles and all the equipment, you have more information about that. I'm using the Beatles as an example, but we don't have to go 50 years back. We can look at pictures today of artists being recorded. You always see the mic, because obviously it's in the face of the singer, but you never see the preamp, and that's part of the public perception and why people think about mics and don't think about preamps.
Totally makes sense. Yeah. You're completely right. Didn't ever see it that way, but it totally makes sense. As usually, yeah, there's never a mic pre on the camera. So how would any musician know that there are actually mic pre's involved, and if he or she doesn't get into the topics of engineering and stuff?
Yeah.
Talking about sound, do you sometimes? Shall I sell still? Maybe, probably not. Record on tape, or is tape some kind of sound source for you, or do you avoid that at any cost?
I'm not opposed to tape, but I don't use it anymore, and I haven't in many, many, many years. And it's not because I'm opposed to tape. I actually have, the studio has two beautiful Studer 24-track tape machines in storage, and they haven't been used in 15 years or more. And the reason is usually comes down to the artist's choice. A lot of artists call us and say, hey, can we record to tape? And we're like, yeah, of course. We just have to get the tape machine out of storage and line it up. And then you have to buy the tape. And the tape is now $350 for 15 minutes at 30 IPS. And so if you're going to record 10 songs and you're going to do, and they're 3-minute songs, and you're going to do 3 takes of each song, you're going to need about, $3,500 worth of tape. And you don't have a backup copy. So if you want every song to be backed up on a second tape, then you need $7,000 worth of tape. And as soon as you have that conversation, they'll go, oh, no, we'll record with the hard drive. And that's why I haven't recorded to tape in 15 or 18 years.
Yeah, that's really, really sensible. And in the end, it's also about, I mean, there are some producers who insist on using tape for the sake of sound and so on. And I really get that, because tape can sound well. It doesn't always, but it can sound really, really well. And I mean, the thing is, you can't really edit it quite nicely, quite as flexibly as you can do on Pro Tools, of course. But in the end, most people using tape as a go-through nowadays, and I think that's the more sensible way of using it. So you're going to tape, yes, you're recording on tape, but you get off the repro head at the same time, or like a second later or something, to put it over on Pro Tools, where you can do all the editing and melodyning or whatever you want to do with it, with your record. So, but still,
no melodyning. I don't do any melodyning.
You don't. So we had that covered as well. Next topic.
Well, I mean, I'm not opposed to melodyning, but I prefer to work with singers that don't need melodyning.
Yeah, it's so much about emotions, because going through such stuff, you might get a better intonation, obviously, but you'll, even if you try your hardest, you will always lose some of the emotion and the realness of the performance. But sometimes that can be part of the sound, of course, but usually it isn't. Cool. As you are one of those engineers / producers that work in so many different genres, I would like to know, does your approach to a recording session, or maybe to a mixing session, or to the whole project as a whole, does it vary from genre to genre? I imagine it's quite different from doing a pop album to doing a jazz album, isn't it?
Yeah, of course there's major differences, but there aren't really that many differences in terms of capturing the sound. You still want to capture the sound in the best possible way, no matter what genre it is. The differences will be in the choice of microphones, in the choice of how you locate the musicians, in what order you record things. There's other differences, but as engineers, we're in the business of capturing sounds in the best possible way, and that applies to all genres.
It surely does. I mean, in the end, it might be on a pop record, there usually is more overdub, isn't there? Like especially on vocals and so on. So you might need a couple more days in the studio. That might be the biggest difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pop records always take forever compared to jazz records. That's why I can do a John Zorn record in 5 hours if it's an improvised record. Most John Zorn records, even the non-improvised ones, never take more than 3 days. We usually track in 1 or 2 days, and then we mix in a third day. Again, because that's also pretty fast turnaround for a full record, but it can work because I get all my sounds while the musicians are working. So when I'm mixing it, everything is faster. I record everything myself, so I know how it's going to sound. And if I record things myself, my mix always comes together quicker. And the musicians that Zorn works with are incredible. And so, they don't need to do 15,000 takes of a vocal or whatever instrument. usually get it right within the first 2 takes, maybe 3, and that's how it comes together.
Yeah. Performance is king. If the performance is right, you just got to capture it correctly. That's
Absolutely.
it. It's not
100%. Performance is always king.
great. Uh, yeah, let's go over to mixing then. Maybe you already mentioned you'd usually mix the records you recorded, but you also sometimes mix without having recorded the record or produced the record. I know that from my personal works, so it is definitely harder and sometimes much harder. But are there points, for example, if you listen to the tracks and you say, well, that's definitely not the right mic or the right room or the right mic pre or whatever for that signal, would you say no to the project, or would you send them back to the production stage, or how do you approach that?
No, I don't say no, because usually when I'm at the stage that I'm hearing the recording the individual tracks of the recording, that means I've already received the tracks, and usually that happens after I've already agreed to mixing a project.
Sure.
Because obviously you have your conversations about the budget and the timeline before you start working. And once I accept, I stick to my word, and I'm a professional. I'll see the project through to the end. I don't bail out on anything or anyone. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. Mixing things that you have not recorded is always harder. Sometimes we get lucky and they've been recorded beautifully by experienced engineers. Other times, sadly, and that happens more and more often these days, they've been recorded in a very poor way in somebody's basement with cheap equipment, because that's how musicians are making records these days. Yeah. And so us mixing engineers have to work twice as hard. And thank God for great tools like Isotope plugins that allow you to get rid of problems and things like that. And we just make it work. We do the best. We do the best with what we're given.
That's basically what the job is. Yeah.
Well, the job should not be that.
Yeah.
The job should be to make something great sound even better. But sometimes the job is to make something lousy sound good enough, or to just make miracles.
Make it work. Yeah. Luckily, that's not always the case, and obviously not with all artists. Nowadays, and I think even before COVID, I assume you do a lot of remote mixing workflows, or do you still have your client attending your mixing session at the studio? How do you do that?
Both. I don't do any attended mixing sessions via Zoom, which I know some of my peers and colleagues do. I don't like that concept at all. I think if we're gonna mix together, it should be in the same room, in the same studio. And if the artist can't be there, doesn't want to be there, or doesn't have the money to rent a studio to do an attended mixing, then I always offer the option of unattended mixing. And I've been doing that for years, many years, 10, 15 years. So it's not a COVID thing for me. 15 years ago, I realized that most artists that I liked, that I wanted to work with, didn't have the budget to work in a big studio like Eastside Sound. And so I taught myself to become a good mixing engineer in the box. And so I usually have the conversation. I say, how do you want to mix this? Do you want to be present? If so, we have to rent a studio, and you can be present. If you can't afford to rent a studio, I can mix it for you unattended. It will be in the box, but obviously mixes in the box have come a long way since 15 years ago. So they sound almost as good as what you can achieve in the studio, because the mixing engineer is what makes the greatest difference.
Absolutely.
And so I can offer them mixes that are much, much cheaper than done at the studio, because they only have to pay for my time and not for the studio time as well.
I see. Well, usually that needs a couple of more revisions, as the artist is not attending the session. Obviously,
Of course.
I mean, in the end,
I always offer free revisions in my mixes, at least 3 free revisions.
Yeah.
If they want to go over, we can talk about it, but usually I always allow for 3 free revisions to make sure everyone is fully happy, fully satisfied. And within 3 revisions, most records get done very quickly. So within the 3 revisions, it's never a problem.
Definitely. And those times you need like 10 plus revisions. Usually there's something wrong in the recording, or the artist simply don't know how they want to sound.
Yeah, it's usually comes down to indecision or inability to express your exact wishes.
Yeah.
But
Communication, the big C, yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think about mixing on headphones? Do you mix on headphones at home, or do you have a proper listening environment?
I always mix on speakers, except when I live and work between New York and London. And in New York, obviously I have access to the studio, and I live in a new building that's very well isolated. In London, I live in a older building that's not as well isolated. So if it's late at night, I have speakers there too, but if it's late at night, I'll use headphones there. So it's not my favorite way of mixing because I prefer speakers, but I'm comfortable mixing in headphones as long as they're good headphones. And I've recently been using the Ollo headphones, OLLO, and I like them very much. The reference series of headphones sound fantastic and are super comfortable. So I've been doing a lot of mixes with those.
Great. Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't use those cans you give your singer to sing on, because that's completely different specs usually.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the Ollo that I mentioned are semi-open, open back. So even though Ollo sells a $15 plate to make them closed, I wouldn't give $300-400 headphones to the singer anyway, because I have like 15 set of headphones for musicians in the studio. Sure. They don't need to be reference studio headphones to do a vocal take.
Yeah, but usually you want them close, and for mixing or even mastering purposes, you would want them open, usually open back or semi-open, something like that.
Yeah, open back for mixing is definitely better.
Yeah, definitely. There's actually a question in the chat here by Diego. He asks, do you also have a home studio, mixing studio, if you say that you don't have to rent a studio for the mixdowns? That's basically what you just said, right? You have a place at home where you mix.
Exactly. I have a spot in both my homes in New York and London, where I basically have a set of speakers, all my plugins, computer, separate screens, and a monitoring routing monitor controller, so I can control my headphones and my speakers. Yeah, I don't have analog summing at home, so that's something that I disclose to the client when they want me to mix records at home unattended. I explain to them that the difference is they will save a lot of money, but it will be in the box and not analog summed like it would be in the studio. And but like I said, the technology has come so far that if it's the same mixing engineer in the same years, the difference that the analog summing does over in the box is, small percent, 5% improvement over in your overall mix. It's not a 50% improvement or 100% improvement like it used to be 15 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. Digital went a long way in the last years, and there are lots of different emulations. And if you have a console like a Neve desk at your studios or whatever, you can only use that console to some. And if you do it in the box, you have the possibility to maybe use some API emulation or whatever. Of course, it's not the real deal, but it goes into the right direction usually. And
I honestly don't use emulation, console emulation when I'm mixing. If I'm mixing in the box, I just mix. I go for the pristine level sounds. If I want to change any sounds, I can do that with plugins. I don't need to emulate the desk,
Yeah.
But that's just my personal approach.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the end, all these emulations usually tend to give you less control than if you just use plugins to reach out to whatever goal you have. Yeah,
Yeah.
it really makes sense here. Um, do you have some mix templates you work with? I mean, especially working in the box, that goes much faster and much cheaper in the end, doesn't it? Do you use
Yeah,
that?
I have my own mix template, which I've been working on and keep developing, and have been for the last 10 years. So it keeps growing and getting more plugins in it and more routing up possibilities. I would like to specify though that my mix template is not a template that has predefined sounds or predefined plugins, because every project is different, and you can't expect that one thing you recorded yesterday will sound the same thing as you recorded today, or will sound the same as somebody else recorded across the country. So
Definitely.
my mixing template has all the routing in place. And then for every reverb, I have like 5 different reverb plugins that I like. But they're all disabled and inactive, so they don't take up CPU resources. So when I import my mixing template, all my routing is done, but I can just decide what reverb will sound best with this vocal, for example. So I have my favorite reverb. I have the Isotope, the Sound Toys Little Plate. That's one of my favorite. I have the HOFA IQ Reverb. That's another one of my favorite. I have the Mac DSP Revolver. That's another one of my favorite. So all those plugins will be all on the same vocal chain in the template, but will all be inactive so that I can audition them. I can enable one at a time and see what works best with the material that I'm working with. That's how my template works, really. And if you want to know more about that, there's a video on YouTube from a talk I did at a Sonic Scoop conference some years ago, 6-7 years ago. That was an old template. It's since grown even into a bigger template, but you can see a little bit more about my template.
Cool, interesting. So that's basically that way. If it doesn't have a fixed sound but just a fixed routing in there, you have the possibility to use that on many different genres, right?
Yeah, so I use the same template on all genres, but that's specifically because my template doesn't have sounds. It just has routing, predefined routing, which is the same for all genres.
Definitely.
And then lots of plugins that are all disabled and inactive, so I can enable them and audition them in the project that I'm mixing.
Yeah, that really makes sense. That's the only way I use templates on myself as well, because I don't want, as every project is so different, I don't want to get at the desk to have like I don't want to approach it like those automatic mastering systems like Blender or something. It's I like the idea to approach every single project and product on its own, and but still, especially those routing things, especially when you're working with outboard summing and so on, it can be quite complicated actually when working with many channels. So it really makes sense to set that up once, to record it later. If you get whenever you get at the studio, you can start right away getting creative, and I really like that.
Yeah, templates are really a shortcut to creativity. So the less you have to work, the less you have to set up before you can make sounds and hear sounds, the better. And that's the way I see a template. It's a shortcut to work more efficiently, but it should not become something that ties your hands behind your back in terms of sounds.
Yeah, not doing the same record over and over again.
Exactly. It should be a workflow thing. It shouldn't be a sound thing.
Yeah, definitely. Totally with you. About sound, especially when mixing or producing artists from remote, especially producing remotely is not that easy as mixing remotely. But we already mentioned the big C, communication, which is so of major importance when working creatively together. Do you Do you insist on some kind of rough mix or references that the artist or client can send you over, or do you prefer just starting from the scratch? Or I mean, for me, that's a good thing to start the conversation, starting from some reference point.
Yeah, I mean, I ask for a rough mix, but I don't need a Pro Tools rough mix. I prefer to start from scratch with my own mix for Pro Tools.
Okay.
But I do like to hear their rough mix, just a 2-track, an MP3 or a WAV file, whatever it is, just so I can hear where they are at. And so I can hear what they're going with. And sometimes it helps to understand how loud they're thinking something should be in the mix. But I always start from scratch. The first thing I do is, clean up the session if they haven't done that. I like getting clean sessions, but they usually come filled with plugins and volume rides. So I delete all the I check what they are. If I see any volume rides that are very important, I listen to them and see if it's something I need to retain. Otherwise, I just delete all the volume rides, all the automation, all the plugins, and start from scratch.
Okay.
And people are always happy.
Cool. So you usually would receive a Pro Tools session from your client coming in?
Well, it depends what the client is working in. If they're working, I have that's part of the conversations at the start of a project. I ask them if they're in Pro Tools. If so, I ask them to just send me the session. If they're in Logic or another DAW, I ask them to export all the files without without plugins, without reverbs, without compression, and to make sure that they all, they're all exported from the same point in time. So there's no sync issues. And then I just import them into Pro Tools. Actually, before I import them into Pro Tools, here's a little tip. There's a great software called Stereo Monoizer that I've been using for years. And I put those because oftentimes people that are not masters of Logic will export mono tracks in stereo, which is annoying.
Yes.
So I import all of those tracks into Stereo Monoizer, and that little $30 or $50 software will check every track to see if it's a real stereo track or if it's just a mono track that's doubled, left and right are identical. If they are, it converts it into a mono track. If something was panned, like in Logic, if somebody pans something slightly to the left, it'll be the same signal on the left, just louder than the right. So it recognizes which one of the two is the louder one and keeps that. So yeah, it's a great software. And if I get tracks from Logic, that's how I go about it.
I see. Yeah, that really makes sense because I'm glad you just mentioned the panning thing, because many people don't get that point, what you just said, that panning doesn't make anything stereo. At least volume pan. Of course, there's some time difference panning. That's something else there. But usually we're talking about just a couple of dB difference between left and right. That's still a mono signal. It's just pan to the left or pan to the right. It's still narrow.
Yeah. Thank God for softwares like Stereo Monoizer. That again, that's part like the template. It's something that really helps the workflow getting faster and better and more efficient.
Yeah, definitely. Good invention, that, and not that hard either. There's a question in the chat which I want to pass on to you from Sali, and he asked for some advice from you how to make a better 3-dimension in rock or metal songs. So basically asking about how to make it a little more spatial in stereo.
Well, assuming he's asking about stereo, not about surround sound, which would be a whole other conversation.
Definitely.
My advice is to think of spatiality in a multi-axis. Don't just think about left and right, but think about the depth of field, depth of perception. For example, if you're listening to a concert live, you are, of course, hearing things left and right according to how and if the sound engineer is panning them in the PA, or if it's an acoustic concert, how the instruments are placed. But you're also perceiving depth of field, and that's often something that's forgotten to mixes. Depth of field has two primary factors that contribute to how we perceive that the depth, the distance. And one is distance, and that's of course delay of the signal. And the other one is frequencies, because frequencies travel differently and get to your ear at different they basically sound different. An instrument sounds different if it's closer to you or further away. If it's further away, because high frequencies get dampened, it basically sounds darker. So that's, I'm generalizing and making it easy to explain that you can achieve three-dimensionality by thinking of depth of field on at least two axes, the left and right, and the front and rear. And trying to think of it that way. And then of course there's reverb, which helps with placing things in that, on the spectrum of those axes. There's many ways you can do it, but think of it as if you were standing in front of the band and what you would hear if you were standing in front of the band. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to start from. In the end, it's just physics in the real world. It's just sound physics. Whatever happens to the waves when they're further away, or if they're around the corner, or if they're nearer to your ear. So basically, we just try to emulate the exact same thing in the mix to make it appear like far or near. The same thing actually with a little bit with front and back as well, but that's talking about binaural. I don't want to get into that topic now. But the same is on the Z-axis actually. You can have it more over your head or more below your head. Actually, you can appear it that way with an EQ as well. There are some physics and physiological things based. You can find all of that in the internet. So basically, you will just need an EQ, maybe of course your volume fader, maybe a little bit of compression, and of course reverb, and you're actually gonna go good with that. Well, I have two more questions here, but before we get into the tip section of our talk, because we're slightly over time. I want to hear from you if there are any new or current projects you've been working on that you want to talk about. Is there anything cool in the pipeline?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the biggest records of my career that I've ever worked on came out in September of last year. So it's already almost been a year, but it's a record that I'm very proud of, got tons of reviews, positive reviews. And it was produced by the late Hal Wilner, who sadly died of COVID in April of last year. Hal was a huge mentor of mine that really shaped my career and my way of working. I have it here. It's called Angel-Headed Hipster, the music of Mark Bolan and T-Rex. And it's a double LP with 27 tracks, I believe, or 28. Great artists like Nick Cave, U2 in duet with Elton John, Kesha, Lucinda Williams, Borns, Joan Jett. There's fantastic artists, and they're all playing the music of T-Rex. And I'm very proud of that record. If you have not heard it, I would recommend you check it out. And then there's a new record that I made, that I produced, and I'm also playing bass and keys on it. It's a quartet. It's more of an ambient jazz. The T-Rex record is a rock record. This new one I'm talking about is more of an ambient jazz record. It's got Lee Ronaldo from Sonic Youth, Jim Jarmusch, the film director, Balázs Pandi, who's a drummer from Hungary, and myself. This cover I'm showing you came out 2 years ago on an Austrian label called Trost. And we made a new record, which came out last week. I don't have the vinyl with me yet, which is why I'm showing you the old record. But the new one came out 10 days ago and is now available in stores everywhere and online and on Bandcamp. And then the last thing I'll mention is a new record that's coming out later this year that I've been working on for 10 years. I'm very proud of that one too. It's a great combination of Tuvan and Mongolian and Siberian throat singing techniques
Wow.
with metal players from all over the world. So there's members of Neurosis, Paradise Lost, Sleep, High on Fire, and they're playing together with these throat singers, which is a technique of creating overtones with your vocal cords and your diaphragm, which is highly developed in Mongolia and Tuva and Siberia, like I mentioned. It's going to be a great record that's coming out later this year, and it's going to be called Steppendoom.
Steppendoom. Yeah. Sounds super interesting. Sounds like something you would really need 10 years to to master that sound, because it's so special.
Yeah, it took a while because these musicians are from all over the world, and it took translators and recording remotely.
Sure.
A lot went into this record, but I'm very proud of the outcome, and it's coming out on a fantastic label that I for now will not mention because I want to let them do the announcement.
Wow. Can't wait to hear that.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, as we're slightly over time, but as you said earlier, you have a couple of minutes left. So at the end, as I know, there are many aspiring audio engineers and producers watching us, and many are maybe even a little bit jealous of a career like yours. So I would like to know from you, as you mentioned earlier, you have some assistants at your studio. You yourself started the standard way as an intern at Eastside. You started your bigger career there. So maybe you, from your now point of view, can tell us a little bit about what you'd expect from an intern or from a perfect assistant to get a good career at the recording studio.
That's a great question. I feel bad for aspiring engineers today who want to take the path of studio work, because there's not a lot of studios anymore left where you can do these internships. Internships are the best way to learn how to behave in a recording studio, and it's about much more than just Pro Tools. I get all these resumes from students from audio schools. They send me their resumes, and the first thing they mention or they highlight is that they're proficient in Pro Tools or they have a Pro Tools certification. And I don't give a damn about a Pro Tools certification, because if you can run Pro Tools but you can't set up a mic, or you get confused by looking at a patch bay, or you don't understand signal path, you're honestly of no use to a professional recording studio. So the most important thing is to learn signal path, and the even more important thing is to learn to be transparent, like a fly on the wall, but be useful when needed. That's one of the best skills that assistants have to master. A lot of them are too eager to and talk too much. Some of them are not proactive enough, and so you have to tell them everything without them actually doing it. Striking the perfect balance between those two is what makes the most useful intern/assistant. All the people that I work with at Eastside Sound start as interns and graduate to assistants. The assistant is the person that's most useful to me. That's the person that I can hire and pay, which I do, to, for example, set up a session for me ahead of time so that I can walk in and all the mics are already on stands, connected, tested. Everything is going to the console, everything is going to Pro Tools, everything is routed correctly, patched into patch bay, and going to the headphones for the musicians. That's a situation I want to walk into. That's a situation that can only be created by an assistant that has paid attention to how I do my setups, and that can read an email. You'll be surprised how many assistants I've had that read an email but don't really read the email. They forget, they're not paying attention to details, which is a very important thing, and they do things a little bit half-assed. They don't pay. Like, I've had assistants in the past that will set up the mic and the preamp that I asked for, but it's set up in the wrong place, or the cable is laying all over the studio, so that when the musician gets in, either they trip over the cable or they run their trolley with their amp over the cables. I don't like that. I like things to be, I like people to think about what's going to happen. Think about the fact that when the drummer comes in, he needs to have some room to set up his toms and his cymbals. So don't get all the mics close so the drummer has to ask me to move all the mics away. Think ahead of time. Be a step ahead. That kind of experience is hard to explain, but it's something you acquire by looking at how sessions are run.
Oh, yeah.
So the interns that I have are always asked to watch what's happening in the session. And when they understand enough to be able to set up a session on their own, that's when they become assistants. That's when I can trust them. I can give them a key to the studio so they can go in ahead of time and open and do all of that. And then from there, the step for them to become engineer is much smaller. But a lot of them don't understand that and expect that they can come and start working and start getting paid. And it just doesn't work that way. We've all put in our hours. We've all paid our dues. I've been an unpaid intern for 2 years before I started getting paid and started doing sessions. And you just have to put in the work.
Yeah, I mean the first month or years you're just watching. You're not really useful at the studio if you don't know yet how a recording session works, or if you're not able to anticipate where the mic's gonna be needed next or something like that. So that comes from watching. So. Cool. That's a good advice, because I think you said a lot about those soft skills, and even the communication aspect. Don't don't rule the room. Don't talk all the day when you're at the studio, and don't be too calm either, and don't be too proactive so everyone gets annoyed by your existence in the room, but still pay attention to the little details and try to anticipate what happens next, and you should be good to go. The rest comes with experience. Cool. Any last advice or tips you want to give out, or some shout out you want to give us?
No, I mean, I think I've talked at length. I don't want to bore people with more. If they have more questions in the chat, I'm happy to answer those.
Sure, yeah. And for those watching this as a recorded version later, obviously just type in your questions in the comments, and I'd be happy to come back to the comment section, answer your questions, or at least try to. Well, thank you very much for your time. It was
You're most welcome.
Pleasure.
If anyone watches this later on YouTube and has questions, but they missed the live event and they want to ask me questions, I'm very reachable. I answer all my messages. You can email me from my website, marcurselli.com. That's MARCURS like Sam, ELLI.com. Or you can DM me on Instagram or on Facebook. I try to answer to everyone. The best way to contact me is definitely by email. So if you want an answer fast, email me. You'll get an answer much quicker than via social media.
There you have it, the direct contact. Thank you very much for your time again. It was a pleasure talking to you, and maybe we'll repeat that in a couple of months or so. Who knows? So long.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. Maybe when the Step and Doom record comes out in September or October, we will have plenty to talk about.
That sounds nice. I'm so looking forward to listening to that record. That sounds really interesting. All right. Thanks again. Have a good day, and see ya.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you for everything.
Nice to meet you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.